morning. Welcome to Rabobank. I'm Todd Charteris. I'm the CEO of Rabobank New Zealand, and thank you all very much for coming. First, I just want to acknowledge the Finance Minister, the Honourable Grant Robertson. It's great to host you here today, Grant, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your scene setting for Budget 2022 in just over 2 weeks' time. Also, a very warm welcome to the Netherlands Ambassador to New Zealand, Her Excellency Mira Walberg. Great to have you here, Mira, and also with Marcia joining us from the Embassy. So fantastic to see you both. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Now, I've noticed not too many people have had some breakfast yet, but on the way out, please feel free to take the breakfast. We're supporting a fabulous group called Eat My Lunch, which donates one free lunch to kids in need for every meal that we purchase. So please, for those that want to take a box of breakfast with you, take one with you, please. Hey, a couple of health and safety instructions. In the event of a fire, please take the stairs, which was just opposite where we came in, down to ground level and meet out at Lambton Quay. And in the event of an earthquake, heaven forbid, please move away from the windows, take cover and hold, and wait until the shaking stop. And again, we'll go down the stairs. Please keep away from the lifts. Now, just look a little bit about Rabobank before I hand over to the Minister. We are proudly New Zealand's only specialist food and agri bank. We were set up in the Netherlands over 120 years ago as a cooperative by farmers for farmers, and today we operate in 38 countries and are amongst the world's 30 largest financial institutions. Here in New Zealand, we have a single focus on supporting Kiwi farmers, growers and food producers. Our 500 employees work from 28 offices in places like Ashburton, Pukekohe, Fielding, and from our new purpose-built head office in Hamilton, which opened late last year. Under our global mission of growing a better world together, Rabobank takes a long-term view of food and agri. We work alongside our rural clients, supporting them to achieve their business goals and to deliver on issues such as sustainability, climate change, water regulations, and so on. Minister, you'll be pleased to know that ever since Rabobank's been in New Zealand, which is about 25 years, every dollar of profit has stayed here and helped us to continue to support and grow in the local market. Our employees are deeply committed to communities where they live and work through volunteer days, community projects and sponsorships. And I do just want to call out 3 examples. 2 years ago, Rabobank partnered with food rescue charity Kiwi Harvest. Kiwi Harvest rescues up to 200,000 kilos of perfectly good food every month that would otherwise end up in landfills and delivers it to families and communities. And it's great to have Kiwi Harvest CEO Gavin Finlay with us here today. Great to see you, Gavin. Secondly, backed by our client councils, we're a supporter of Surfing for Farmers, which assists the mental wellbeing of farmers by getting them off farm and into the surf through the summer months, and it's really been a positive and really popular program again this year. And the third example I just want to talk to is our sponsorship of the Agribusiness in Schools program. There are now over 3,000 secondary school students at more than 100 schools around the country supporting studying agribusiness, encouraging and preparing them for possible careers in the sector. And so hopefully by that you see that we're really strongly connected to our communities. And overall, Rabobank's strategy is to become New Zealand's leading food and agri bank. And we'll do that being backed by a global team of research analysts. We have access to the latest in-depth insights into food and agri market trends and opportunities. And more broadly, we're committed to working with policymakers to provide input to key issues through the eyes of our clients. In the past few years, we've made policy submissions on issues ranging from farm debt mediation, the Zero Carbon Bill, freshwater regulations, the Climate Change Commission's interim advice, and just a few weeks ago on the exotic forestry framework within the emissions trading scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, through the COVID pandemic, the food and agri sector once again demonstrated its huge contribution to the New Zealand economy and to the well-being of regional communities right up and down our country. And long may that continue. Rabobank is committed to ensuring that the opportunities and challenges facing the sector are discussed openly and constructively. And Minister, hosting you here this morning, I hope is a demonstration of that commitment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the government's priorities in Budget 2022. And Minister, if I can just say, if the ink's not dry yet on the budget, it would be great to see a little bit extra support for research and innovation in the primary sector, especially in technology around reducing greenhouse gases emissions. So it's just an idea. Give it some thought. So with that, I'll just hand over to the Minister and look forward to it. Thank you.
Kia ora, nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ata good morning. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks very much to Rabobank for hosting us today. Can I also acknowledge the Netherlands Ambassador as well, and also my parliamentary colleague, Kieran McAnulty, who's popped over the hill from the Wairarapa this morning. He knew there was a free breakfast. You'll find him everywhere in Wellington for that. And thanks to all of you for coming along today. It's an early start, and I recognise that. Yesterday, New Zealand opened its borders again to tourists and business visitors from around 60 visa waiver countries as we continue our reconnection with the world. The resumption of tourism and recent trade missions led by the Prime Minister to Singapore and Japan show that New Zealand is open for business. We are in a strong position to plan for New Zealand's future in a post-COVID world. I want that future to be one where we provide economic security to all New Zealanders, while delivering higher wage jobs that support a low emissions economy. Today, I want to outline how Budget 2022 will contribute to that goal, and in particular, how we are going to rebuild and maintain a strong fiscal position while tackling the major challenges that face our economy and society. The context in which we are doing this was unimaginable just 2 years ago. COVID has changed everything. And while we have come through strongly, alongside the success, there have been significant costs for many businesses, sectors of our economy, and on individuals, particularly when it comes to mental health. This is not unique to New Zealand, of course. The effects of the pandemic, the anxiety and uncertainty, are something that the World Health Organization has recognised as being a global phenomenon. I want to acknowledge, particularly given Rabobank's role and the representation in this room, the work and dedication of our farmers and growers who have kept the exports moving and the income arriving during the pandemic. The merchandise trade figures that were out last week show just how strongly goods exports have grown during the pandemic. In the year to March 2022, our goods exports were up by more than 8% compared to March 2020. In the past year alone, both milk powder and meat exports are up by more than 15%. The partnerships created between business and government to help make this happen were invaluable, particularly the air connectivity scheme that we funded to keep exports flying in and out as global air freight was about to dry up during worldwide lockdowns. But if the pressures of a global pandemic weren't enough, the world is now faced with a global inflation spike as a result of the ongoing supply chain disruptions and the war in Ukraine. Recently, the US recorded inflation of 8.5%, Canada 6.7%, Germany 7.3%. I've left the Netherlands out, Ambassador. UK 6.2%, with recent forecasts that it will grow towards 8%. The very latest OECD average for inflation was 7.7% in March, putting New Zealand about the middle of the pack. Now, even if the inflation spike is expected to be temporary, this does not take away the significant impact it is having on households and businesses. That's why we've moved quickly to cut fuel excise and halve the price of public transport to support New Zealanders who are feeling pain at the pump. This is on top of changes to increase income support for low and middle income families from the 1st of April, and then from Sunday just gone, the resumption of the winter energy payment to help those on income support and our superannuitants to meet the costs of heating their homes this winter. This is all part of our plan to move away from broad-based economic support, which was needed during COVID, and towards more targeted support to help manage our costs and avoid exacerbating inflation. We're also focused on addressing the constraints and forces that are fueling inflation, including through our immigration rebalance, supermarket competition reform, and reducing our reliance on volatile commodities like oil. In the face of the challenges that we have, it is comforting to know that New Zealand has done well during COVID-19 compared to the rest of the world. Our economy has come through the COVID shock better than almost anywhere else. We have received 2 AAA credit ratings from the 2 leading agencies, something few countries in the world are able to say. GDP is up 5.6% from a year ago, and our economic activity is higher than it was before COVID-19. Unemployment is at a record low of 3.2%, against expectations when COVID hit that it could rise as high as 10%. Wages have outpaced inflation up until this recent spike and are forecast to do so again for every year after 2022, meaning households are better off. Our debt is set to peak at about half of Australia's, around a third of that in the UK, and around a fifth of the US, measured consistently as a percentage of GDP. None of this has happened by accident. It happened because we realised in New Zealand that a strong health response to COVID-19 was also the best economic response. It happened because we were prepared to step in with more than $20 billion of direct support for businesses and workers through the wage subsidy and resurgent support schemes. Our calculated and considered economic policies during COVID have worked for New Zealand and New Zealanders. And we are now in a strong position as we look at what investment is required to grow the economy further as we plan for what the new normal looks like in a world where COVID is under control and as inflation rates return back down towards more normal levels. I'm not underestimating what a challenging period of time we are in for the New Zealand or global economy. But our success means being able to provide economic security in a volatile world and close the infrastructure gap as we plan for the future. And that's where Budget 2022 represents a key marker in our response to and recovery from COVID-19. Today, I will outline our fiscal policy approach for the budget, and in a speech next week, I will talk further about how the budget will promote our economic security and overall well-being, so you get the technical speech, sorry. I mentioned a moment ago our comparatively strong debt position. This chart is the IMF's most recent net debt forecast in a measurement which is consistent across countries. These are their very latest forecasts, released during April, and so it incorporates all of the IMF's analysis of COVID spending and investments announced to date around the world. You can see the strength of our position. Our net debt is forecast using the IMF measure to peak at just over 21% of GDP next year and then fall over coming years down to 16%. I'm using the IMF's comparisons because it provides a more consistent framework for making cross-country comparisons. New Zealand has actually been an outlier in international circles in terms of how we measure our net debt. Compared to this slide, our main net debt measure reads at 35.2% of GDP in the latest Crown accounts to the end of February, with the half-yearly update forecasting it to peak at 40.1%. I can announce today, he said, hoping it's there, yep. I can announce today that we have accepted the Treasury recommendation that New Zealand starts using a new headline debt measure that is more comprehensive and will move New Zealand much closer to the international norm to help compare our fiscal sustainability against others around the world. The measure will better reflect the sustainability of our government's finances. This means it will include a wider range of our assets, in particular the New Zealand Super Fund, but also our liabilities, including debt held by other Crown entities, such as Kāinga Ora or Waka Kotahi, that have previously not been covered by the core net debt figure. The new measure gives us a net debt figure about 20 percentage points lower than the current one. The budget documentation will continue to publish the old measure for transparency and the ability to make historical comparisons. This will be the fourth budget that we have put together using the wellbeing approach. Essentially, this recognises that there are many aspects to what makes for a successful economy and society. We need strong finances and sustainable growth as much as we need healthy and educated people, clean air to breathe and water to drink, and strong communities where we look after each other. Our economic security and future are determined as much by our health and mental health, the skills and education and the people that people have, and the housing that we live in. To get to that position, we need to do things differently as a government. We need to break down the silos between departments. We need to look further ahead to how our directions affect future generations and to make sure that we address the big, complex challenges that lie ahead. Over my time as Minister of Finance, I've been aware that the way we put a budget together can have a huge influence over whether we're moving towards our goals. One of the early changes we made was to move from an annual capital allowance to a multi-year capital allowance. When I became Minister, annual allowances meant that a large capital purchase could wipe out much of the allowance in a given year, and as public accounting rules require the full cost to be booked when a decision is made, rather than when the expenditure actually occurs. By moving to a rolling 4-year allowance, we've given ourselves much needed room to better plan our investments and give certainty to those that we work with to deliver them. In Budget 2022, we will be making further changes to modernise our budget processes to support a long-term, more joined-up approach that is essential to delivering improved wellbeing. I've already indicated that there will be 2 major areas of focus for new spending in the budget: health and climate change. In both cases, we will be moving to multi-year funding allocations to better control costs by allowing for long-term planning. Our reforms of the health system are designed to end the unfair postcode lottery and inequities of the DHB model that I know have been felt acutely in rural areas. The current health system is incredibly inefficient. Over the past 2 decades, DHBs have learned to run annual deficit after annual deficit because they know the annual budget process allows them to do that. We're putting an end to that. Budget 2022 introduces initially a 2-year funding allocation as we get our new streamlined health system up and running. Once that's fully in place, health will be placed on a 3-year budget so that they can plan for what services New Zealand will need and then put their heads down to get on with the job of delivering services instead of delivering deficits. We're also making an important update to our budget process to ensure we have the ability to make the significant investments we need to tackle the complex, multi-generational issue of climate change. That's why we have set up a dedicated funding stream for our climate change investments by recycling the proceeds from the emissions trading scheme directly into a climate emergency response fund. It will operate as a 4-year rolling fund that will allow us to kick off the major programs required to meet the emissions budget set by the Climate Commission and to invest in important technology and innovation, Todd. This works very much like the National Land Transport Fund works to fund our transport projects, where fuel excise and road user charges are protected to be only used for investment in transport. It will provide the confidence that we can plan ahead with certainty, and it means our climate investments don't add to debt. The other change we're making in terms of the structure of the budget is the piloting of long-term funding for 2 clusters of departments, in this case in the Justice and Natural Resources area. We've undertaken an expenditure review for the departments covered by each cluster. The funding that has been allocated is connected to key goals jointly set by the groups of ministers and departments that will receive the funding. Not only is this breaking down silos, but the clusters are funded for 3 years, meaning that they do not have to come back for funding for programs each year. Departments and agencies have the certainty of funding so they can plan ahead, lock in longer-term contracts to have greater certainty on costs, hire the experts they need, and put in place plans to be able to manage cost fluctuations. Now, I apologise if all of this is a little bit pointy-headed, but it's important. We have to plan better if we're going to deliver better outcomes. We need to give more certainty and direction if we're going to meet the challenges ahead and maintain fiscal discipline. These public finance reforms are critical to underpinning our future success as a country. The other significant shift that you'll see in Budget 2022 is the return of fiscal rules to guide our budget. Many of you will remember that when Labor came to office in 2017, we committed to a set of fiscal rules called the Budget Responsibility Rules. They included running overgale surpluses while reducing debt to below 20% of GDP. On the debt side, we achieved that in our first budget and indeed in our second, and we ran 2 surpluses in the 2 years before COVID hit. Then COVID obviously changed all of that. Just as the previous national government ran deficits and increased net debt following the GFC and the Canterbury earthquakes, we have done the same to protect New Zealanders from the effects of COVID-19. Throw in the impact of the war in Ukraine and the ongoing supply chain disruption as a result of COVID-19, and we're faced with running 5 years of deficits compared to National's 6. The first surplus since the 2018-19 year is expected in 24-25. The keen-eyed among you will realise that this is a year later than we set out in December. We are not alone in toning down some of our expectations as a result of the war and ongoing supply chain issues. The IMF has said global growth will average 3.5% over 2022, down from the 4.4% it had previously forecast in January. All that said, achieving a surplus within the next 3 fiscal years at a quicker rate than National did after the GFC is something that I'm proud to be able to do as Minister of Finance. It's important that we return to surplus in a measured and balanced way that supports New Zealanders through COVID and its ongoing impacts. But it's also important that we do return to surplus, because that gives us the best ability to address that key challenge of closing New Zealand's infrastructure gap. The path for returning to surplus also puts downward pressure on inflation. Over the past few months, I have been working with the Treasury to chart a course for a more sustainable and secure fiscal position. In its advice to me, the Treasury focused on being able to achieve 3 objectives. Firstly, over time, being able to finance current spending from current revenues. Secondly, being able to borrow finance for high-quality intergenerational capital investments. And thirdly, retaining the capacity to borrow to support economic stability in the event of large economic shocks by ensuring that our debt levels remain prudent. The new fiscal rules will ensure we're controlling spending, keeping a lid on debt, and are able to make those important investments in infrastructure. The first new fiscal rule that I'm announcing today is a commitment that once we reach our Obergale surplus, as planned in 2024-25, we will maintain that within a low range of 0% of GDP to 2% of GDP over time. The range is based on advice from the Treasury and is the same as the forecast ahead of the 2017 election under the previous government's spending plans for the coming years. The surplus rule will also be the primary rule that controls our spending decisions and requiring value for money. The surplus means current spending is paid for from current revenues. It means the current generation is paying for its own consumption, taking pressure off inflation and putting in the country in a better position to invest in infrastructure for future generations. It means day-to-day government spending is not adding to the debt that we have as a country. It allows us to control and reduce debt, with Treasury's analysis showing that the position of the surplus or deficit is the main driver of changes in net debt. It's equally important that we don't run surpluses too large in such a way as to undermine the necessary investments that we make to run essential public services. The surplus rule will give us the flexibility to dip temporarily into a technical deficit from time to time for very specific reasons. This includes when we have to book upfront expenses at the start of an infrastructure project, or where a major government program is required, or to fund major infrastructure projects that will be delivered by entities other than central government. The surplus target will be measured over time as opposed to year on year. Again, this is a sensible approach that means a surprising fiscal shock in 1 year, like a major asset revaluation or if a major trading partner experiences a short recession, doesn't crowd out other government spending on areas like health, particularly if the shock is going to reverse out again. For the purposes of the Public Finance Act, the government has to set its long-term objectives for 10 years. So in the budget documents, the surplus target will be measured over this time period, with annual reporting each year continuing. That brings me to the second fiscal rule that I'm announcing today. Based on advice from Treasury, we will introduce a net debt ceiling for the government that will ensure New Zealand maintains some of the lowest government debt in the world, while having room to respond to the types of shocks we typically experience every decade, and being able to make the vital infrastructure investments that are needed to support our economy. Using the old measure of net debt, the Treasury has recommended the ceiling be 50% of GDP. When we translate that to the new measure, that cap is 30% of GDP. The Treasury considers that this is a prudent level of debt, particularly when combined with the Obergale surplus rule. In developing advice, the Treasury has followed an approach set out by the International Monetary Fund on sustainable debt levels. This includes an estimate of what would be a sustainable limit or peak in the event of a 1 in 100 year shock that would see debt spike significantly higher than the ceiling. For the purposes of our fiscal rules, we are comfortable that a ceiling of 30% or 50% on the old measure takes this into account and gets the balance of discipline and room to invest right. So where would a 30% ceiling place us in the world if it were fully used? I want to take you back this time to the graphical version of the IMF chart I showed earlier. The 30% ceiling is one that is internationally comparable because it means our debt is measured in a similar way to the likes of Australia. The IMF forecasts show we are setting our ceiling at a lower level than debt readings that Australia is expected to produce, and our actual net debt position will be about half of Australia's. It's important to note the debt ceiling is not a target, and we are tracking well and truly under it. In light of current inflationary pressures and capacity constraints, we will not be increasing the planned multi-year capital allowance for budget 2022. This will give us time to ensure that in future budgets we are making investments in the most effective and efficient way possible and in line with the infrastructure strategy that was released yesterday. This does mark a shift in position for the Treasury to recommend such a change. They have noted that in their advice to me that a low point level target which has been set at a below fiscally sustainable level has happened in our past. These targets can lead to decisions to not fund critical infrastructure in a timely manner, and it's timely to move away from that. As the Infrastructure Commission made clear in its strategy released yesterday, New Zealand has a gaping infrastructure deficit. One estimate fed into that report is that New Zealand is sitting on an infrastructure deficit of $104 billion. Every one of us knows what that looks and feels like in real life. It's the hours of productivity lost stuck in Auckland's traffic. It's the burst water pipes here in the capital. It's the rundown hospitals in the provinces. For decades as a country, we have failed to make the investments that we need to drive productivity and improve well-being. New Zealand's population grew from 3 million to 4 million across 30 years from 1973 until 2003. We then grew from 4 million to 5 million in just on half of that time. But we didn't build the houses or the public transport networks or the public services needed to match up with that population growth. I'm not prepared for our country to be on the back foot any longer when it comes to infrastructure. Our investments using the fiscal headroom created by this fiscal rule will need to be high quality, well thought through, and have a clear and direct benefit to our productivity and well-being. There is a critical balance here for us to grasp. We can keep a lid on debt while finally making progress on our infrastructure challenges. In conclusion, there's no doubt that COVID has been tough the world over, and there will be difficult times for many New Zealanders for a while as we continue to respond to the global pandemic and deal with the rising cost of living. But New Zealanders have worked hard and put us in a strong position to be able to deal with that. And I'm excited about the opportunities New Zealand has created for itself off the back of our world-leading COVID response. It is now time to move back to a position where we have clear fiscal rules. As a person who came to my political consciousness in the 1980s, I know the damage that can be done when we lose the balance of our fiscal position. The impact falls most heavily on those who can least afford it. Equally, knee-jerk reactions, short-term responses can mean that we fail to invest in what our country needs for the future. Our fiscal approach means we can plan for the future. We can rip off the Band-Aid approach to infrastructure and invest properly to future-proof for future generations. We can help them battle climate change, help them be more productive, make it quicker and safer to move around our country and get our goods to market. This will be a pivotal change as we move towards a high-wage, low-emissions economy that provides economic security in good times and in bad. Thank you for listening today, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Kia ora koutou. The media get lots of questions at the end, so this is your chance.
Minister, can you just unpack the natural resources cluster
Yeah.
a little bit more? And the second one would be ETS recycling. What's the value of that?
Sure. On the latter point, we signalled at the end of last year, it's about $4.5 billion that we've been looking at as a package, but that's a 4-year rolling fund, and so it will obviously get added to. I think the basis was the $75 a tonne. I think when we set it happened to be the rate when we did set it. There's a little bit of volatility there, but we can plan ahead over the cycle. So about $4.5 billion in the fund as we kick it off. On the clusters, thank you for asking too. Natural resources includes environment, primary industries, conservation, somebody else in there too. But that area where we're looking at what we can do in some aspects of energy and resources. We're looking there at what we can do to get a clear set of guidelines. It is separate from that climate fund, so those agencies will be obviously working on issues within the climate response, but it does go to many of the things that I know people in this room work on with the sector, around how we do farm management plans, how we support people in that kind of space, some of the research and innovation issues that Todd raised earlier. But the point of these clusters is to actually get agencies to have a common set of goals. And we often say it, people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to use the services of MPI, followed by the services of MFE, followed by the services of DOC. People wake up and think, what am I doing and how can I work with the government as a whole to do that? And so that exercise of setting those goals for the sector, which we'll publish at the budget, has been really significant. The other aspect is, which not all of the ministers and departments totally appreciated, was that we did do an expenditure review across those clusters to say, well, where is your current spending? But the really important element of those clusters is the ability to say, here's 3 years of funding. And this is the whole thing about the annualised budget process, which while it's got some benefits in terms of constantly checking and rechecking what you're doing, it does make it harder to plan. It does make it harder to do long-term contracts. It arguably makes it more expensive for government because we can't do some of that long-term contracting that we should. These are pilots, that's the other thing that I should say. So we've done one in justice, one in natural resources. We'll take a breath after the budget to look at how that might roll out further in the future. But the kind of changes that we've made with the multi-year capital allowance and the multi-year funding for health and climate and this, I think are significant changes, probably more for the Public Finance Act nerds in the room, but of whom there are some. But it is a really important shift. But the detail of that, our natural resources priorities will be released on budget day. Thoughts, questions? Roger.
Minister, has the environment we're in made it a more challenging budget to set this time round, or has it ironically given sort of greater clarity and focus?
I'm yet to find a budget that isn't challenging to put together. It's number 5, and they've all been interesting. But yeah, in all seriousness, the global economic environment is presenting a number of challenges, and obviously the spike in inflation and the cost of living pressures as well. I think for New Zealand, what's important is that the underlying fundamentals of our economy are strong. And that's recognised internationally, so that's not just me saying that. You know, the ratings agencies came in one case gave us a lift to AAA, and in another case reaffirmed us at AAA. IMF, OECD, they've all said similar things. And that underlying strength means that we can make decisions that are just beyond the short term in a way that maybe 1 or 2 other countries can't. I've all said also when we put the budget policy statement out that there's a one-off element to this budget. Didn't cover today. We'll in much detail. We'll cover next week and more, and that's the health reforms. So they can, in order to reset the health sector, that requires a one-off boost of spending. Once you look at the costs of running an education system and the costs of doing housing and the basics of public services, that sucks up a fair bit of what's remaining. So people shouldn't be looking at this budget as one where they'll see money being tossed about. It's a budget where we will be making sure that we have plans to be able to grow the economy sustainably, run our public services, and make some pretty important shifts. So, yep, we always have to keep the global environment in mind. Okay.
So the new, this is probably one of the final qualifiers, the new net debt measuring sort of expands the scope for things that are considered core Crown assets and borrowings. What was the reason previously for excluding those? What's the difference in rationale?
Gentleman sitting behind you can possibly answer that question better than me, but it is actually, my understanding is that there have been concerns about the volatility, particularly of the super fund, and including the super fund in there. And one of the things New Zealanders may need to get used to with the new measure is that there'll be a bit more movement in the net debt numbers. They've been pretty solid through a calendar year or through a budget forecast cycle. You may see a bit more movement because obviously the super fund operates in a more volatile environment. So I understand that that was probably one of the drivers. From our perspective, shifting is important for two main reasons, just to reiterate. The first of those is the international comparability. I mean, every single budget event I've done for 5 years, I've put an IMF chart up and had to explain, well, actually, this is not how we measure it, this is how they measure it. We're much closer now to other countries. Everyone's got little nuances, but the IMF pull it together in such a way that we can see how it looks. So what the number that will come out will be slightly different from that, but very much closer to it. The second reason is that it's a much more accurate picture of our fiscal position. The super fund is the super fund. It's there. It exists. It's part of what New Zealanders have built up over time. On the flip side, the national government opened up the possibility of kāinga ora borrowing off its own balance sheet. We carried that on, but that didn't count against net core crown debt, which, frankly speaking, was giving a false impression of where the debt level was. And so again, I was coming along to budget briefing saying, well, it's 19%, and then if you add one, it's 20, for kāinga ora, it's 20%. So we're actually getting a much better picture with this debt rule, or this debt measure rather, around both assets and liabilities in the economy. So I feel confident about it. Treasury made the recommendation, and I've accepted it.
Minister, could you please comment on the economic and cultural factors that have enabled New Zealand to keep the debt levels quite low over a sustained period, and also is it too conservative?
Yeah, I think New Zealanders have understood the importance of saving for a rainy day. And we saw that with COVID. It poured down, and if I can extend the metaphor horribly, the umbrella was able to be put up because we had done that work. And so I think New Zealanders have understood that. Where, if I'm being objective and step back, New Zealanders' private debt, the chart doesn't look quite so rosy, relatively speaking, but from a government debt perspective, we've had that, and I think that's been important. As I alluded to in the speech, and indeed as Treasury have put in their advice to me, I do think point level targets that are low have not been prudent yet. And what the Public Finance Act obliges me as the Minister of Finance to do is to keep a level of prudent debt. Now, obviously, one aspect of being prudent is to keep it relatively low, but I don't think it's prudent to have a debt target that means you don't invest in the infrastructure we need for the future. To me, that's the opposite of being prudent. And so the shift is actually to recognise the very point that you're raising, which is that if we continually go for that target that is very low, we will do future generations a disservice. But it's always a balance, and that's why putting the two fiscal rules together is important. So one part of it is an Obergale surplus, which means from an operating perspective, we have to be careful, and we can't fund that in the future. We can't fund that out of debt. But we can fund those long-term capital investments to a greater extent. And even when we do it, we end up lower than where most countries are. I really hope we can have a mature conversation about public debt in New Zealand. I've been alluding to this for the last year or so, that I think it is important that we do that. It is a balance, but I think you only need to look around the infrastructure in New Zealand to see what the risk is. And if I can pop a little advert in, the Infrastructure Commission's strategy that was released yesterday is a document well worth everyone having a look at. 68 recommendations about what we need to do differently in New Zealand. And it's not all about more money. Some of it is about making sure that we use our assets much better, that we plan and design and procure our infrastructure much more effectively and efficiently. Because actually, we couldn't possibly meet the deficit that we've got in, say, 10 years even, if it was just about adding more money in. We don't have the capacity inside the country to do that anyway. So we've got to do both. We've got to put more money in. This debt target gives us the ability to do that. But equally, we've got to be better at how we do it.
Thanks, Minister, for that update, and really insightful. And I certainly really enjoyed getting the detail around how the fiscal policy and budget rules are set. And like any business, I think, and your last point is actually about how we spend it. And I think that's for any business it's the same, but also for the government. So I look forward to the further detail on that. Hey, so look, that concludes
local government debt inside, and that is one of the differences with some other jurisdictions around the world.
A critic or a cynic could look at this and say that you've included the massive assets in the New Zealand super fund, and you've basically you've used that to create a more favourable debt position.
No, we haven't. What we've done is created a more transparent and clear fiscal position, and you'll note that it's pretty much what every other country in the world does, give or take the odd difference. It enables us to internationally compare ourselves accurately. It also makes sure that we look at liabilities as well as assets that we have. And obviously for this budget we will be publishing both, so people will be able to see both the old indicator and the new one.
So why didn't you do this 5 years ago?
Minister, a big focus of the speech is on economic stability. Have you curbed your so-called addiction to spending?
Well, what I've done is continued what I've been doing since I've been the Minister of Finance, which has been careful and balanced in what we do. Every government in the world had to respond to COVID, and New Zealand responded to COVID in such a way that we've come through it with one of the best economic results and one of the best health results in the world. That did mean spending money. It was important to do so. I recall my political opponents at times asking me to spend more money. And so I think we've got the balance right over the years. What this speech is about, though, is making the point that we do need fiscal rules. We do need anchors and indicators of our success. Under COVID, they were very hard to be able, obviously, to stick to. And so what we will do is now have those going forward.
But are you worried that New Zealanders don't trust you with your economy?
Well, I think the Labor government got voted back in 2020. That was on the basis of the fact that the New Zealand economy had done well, but also that our health response had been good. New Zealanders will have different views about different people, but I can stand proudly, I think, on the record of both being fiscally careful, but also investing where we need to.
There's no change to the capital allowance. Is there a change to the operating allowance?
No, there's not.
Why have you decided to freeze that operating allowance, given the scale of the infrastructure deficit ahead of us?
Well, the freeze capital allowance, you mean. Look, I think with the multi-year capital allowance being 9.8 billion, there's plenty of room for us to do investments this year. But the big reason for that is that I do not want in a capacity constrained, supply constrained environment to be throwing anything more in right now. We also now have the time to make sure that any future capital investments are well thought through. So effectively what we're saying is this will apply from budget 2023.
So that IMF forecast, I know it's not the same as the Treasury one that's going to come out in a couple of weeks' time, but that implies you're going to have 15 percentage points or so of fiscal headroom in 5 years' time. Do you want to use some of that fiscal headroom to solve the infrastructure deficit?
Absolutely, and that is the reason for why we've set the rule in the way we have. We also need to be careful to make sure that we protect ourselves against, I guess, what I'd call short-term shocks. So the Treasury's work, and you'll see the analytical note when they release it today if they haven't already, that they looked at the way in which 1 in 10-year shocks could be managed and manage those within that fiscal headroom along with the infrastructure investment, and then the 1 in 100-year style shocks like the COVID shock can be managed above the ceiling. And so they actually calibrated it on that basis. So yes, part of that headroom can be used for investments in infrastructure, and part of it we need to make sure we carefully put aside to deal with those short-term shocks.
So is there enough headroom to solve that infrastructure deficit? Because it's measured at a couple of $100 billion.
We'll make a significant dent in the infrastructure deficit over the next few years as a result of this. But as I said yesterday, and as the Infrastructure Commission said yesterday, this can't all be about additional money. We don't have the capacity in New Zealand to be able to solve the infrastructure deficit in a short number of years. What we have to do is be better at infrastructure. And there are a number of very good recommendations about the way that we design, the way we plan, the way we procure, the way that we're more efficient and effective with the use of our existing assets. If you put that together with the additional headroom that's available here, then I think we can make a real dent in the infrastructure deficit. One more, Bernard.
Why not use the balance sheet properly then to solve it? Why can't we afford a doubling of infrastructure investment over 30 years?
It's all a balance, Bernard. It's making sure that we do look after the finances in such a way to deal with shocks. And unfortunately, we get 1 in 10-year style shocks like the GFC that come along. We get the COVID shocks, and then we get earthquakes. And so we do have to have that balance. But you yourself have just pointed out the scale of the percentage point increase that would be possible over the next 10 to 15 years, that is a significant level of investment.
Just on the climate funding that you talked about coming out of the ETS, is that going to be enough? How can you say you're not going to have any climate debt?
Oh, well, no, what I'm saying is that we can fund the investments we're making through this fund without adding to debt. Don't get me wrong, every single institution and organisation in New Zealand is going to have to step up to make sure we respond properly around climate. We will not meet the goals that we'll be lining out in our emissions reductions plans shortly if the private sector is not involved, if communities are not involved. But this is a start. It can kick off some programs, but it won't be the end of the road by any means.
Why now? The Crown's balance sheet
How long has this been on the cards for you, all these changes? Because it does look like it's a reaction to the opposition saying that
No, it's not. And I think it's really important that we all have a little bit of perspective here. Let's go back to 2018 and 2019 before COVID. We were able to make sure that we had surpluses, that we kept debt lower than the National Party had it. Our percentage of spending is about the same as the National Party's was when they were coming off the back of the GFC, and it's forecast to come down as a percentage of GDP. What we did during COVID was the right thing to do. We supported New Zealanders, businesses and households. Yes, we had to spend money, but that made sure that we've got unemployment at 3.2% and we've got international ratings agencies, the IMF, the OECD, all saying that New Zealand has done well. The opposition's rhetoric is just that.
But
rhetoric.
why?
In your speech, you mentioned the cost of living pressures a number of times. But can New Zealanders expect any easing of those pressures or any additional measures in the budget?
I've been really clear that the budget's focus is around the health reforms and around climate change. We've made significant investments in supporting New Zealanders through the cost of living pressures, the cut to the fuel excise duty, the halving of public transport, the lifting of income support. We've got the winter energy payment in place. We'll always look to see if there are ways that we can support New Zealanders, but to be clear, the priorities of the budget have been made clear and they are health and climate change.
There will be nothing in the budget.
I'm not announcing the budget today, but I've been very clear about the priorities. Brian.
You mentioned the downgrades to the outlook for global growth. Do you see further downside risks there, given that Europe, China and the US are all looking to be vulnerable there? And does this have any bearing on the budget?
Obviously, each budget, the Treasury produces its central scenario and then an up and a downside, and so that you'll certainly be able to see in the budget where the Treasury thinks that's going. There continues to be divided opinion globally about how hard or soft any landing will be and whether or not a recession is on the cards. But clearly the IMF have downgraded their global growth forecasts. For New Zealand, we still believe we're in a strong position. The underlying fundamentals of our economy are strong and we can therefore invest from there. So I haven't significantly changed plans at this point, but we will continue to be careful. And to preempt Bernard's question he's about to ask me, this is one of the reasons why we have to keep a careful balance in our position and not go beyond where I believe we've got to here.
But why make
We'll go with Brian again.
The Public Finance Act says that one of the things you have to have regard to in setting fiscal policy is its interaction with monetary policy. Has that been cast any sort of shadow over this budget?
Not particularly, because I'm very well aware, as we all are, of the track that the Reserve Bank's on. They've been clearly signalling that. Obviously, they made a 50 basis point rise most recently, but their overall track has been clearly signalled. So, yes, of course, we take that into account, but it hasn't changed particularly. I'll let Bernard ask this question.
This one's actually about your announcement about the climate spending not increasing the debt. How can the government or any government respond to climate properly unless it uses its balance sheet?
And it will, and we will, I am sure, in the future. Some of that infrastructure investment that we're talking about for the future will be climate related. The point I was making is the Climate Emergency Response Fund doesn't add to the debt
So
because it's
overall,
ETS.
you're saying it's possible in the long run that you do want to use the balance sheet, i.e. increase debt a bit to deal with climate?
Inevitably, some of the changes we have to make sure that we are climate resilient, that we are mitigating and adapting, will be infrastructure investment. And so therefore, yes.
Why now? Why? You've been finance minister for 5 years now. This is your 5th budget. You've talked about how this is the way that the IMF have measured debt for a long time. Why have you decided to do this now and not when you did your first budget back in 2018?
I think I've been talking to the Treasury about it since fairly soon after I came in, and then there was this little thing called COVID that happened, and so we had to deal with that. Those conversations with the Treasury restarted this year, and we were able to come up with this position.
So are you shifting the goalposts around debt?
No, what we're doing is more accurately representing New Zealand's fiscal position and putting it in line with the rest of the world, and everybody will transparently be able to see in the budget where our debt is on the old measure and where our debt is on the new measure.
Moving away from a point target, debt target to a ceiling and the Obergall sort of golden rule that you've got, would suggest that New Zealand could probably get used to not having debt levels go down apart from the sort of denominator effect of the economy growing. Is that part of your conversation on debt, that debt will probably stabilise and not, there won't be a relentless focus on reducing debt levels?
I think there needs to be a focus on making sure that debt levels are sustainable and prudent. And it is a ceiling, not a target. And so the kinds of initiatives that we will fund through infrastructure will need to be ones that meet a high bar. We also have to keep that buffer in there as well. But it is a different conversation, yes. And I think the point I was making and that Treasury also made in their advice to me is that a low specific set target can end up, they didn't use this language, but can end up leading to perverse behaviour where you don't invest in things that you need to because you're pursuing that. And as I say, every New Zealander knows what that feels like in real life when they're stuck in traffic or they don't have the water quality that they need.
You mentioned yesterday...
We'll just go to Amanda and then Amelia, sorry.
Yes, thank you. On cutting that $6 billion of additional spending, so does that mean that other services or other projects will have to suffer to pay for the things like the health reforms that had been set aside for?
Oh, we always have to make difficult decisions when we're putting a budget together. There's always more things that are bid for than we have money to do. The point I made right back in December was that there was a one-off element to the operating allowance in order to reset the health system. The remainder of the operating allowance, there are considerable pressures. Inflation helps the government's books on money coming in, but it also costs us on money going out. And so the cost of running the education system or providing housing increase as well. So you will see in the budget that there is room for new initiatives to sustainably grow the economy. There's room for new initiatives to push forward in some of those social services. But actually, a lot of this is just making sure New Zealanders have access to good quality public services.
You mentioned the bids would have already been in by the time that funding was announced. So what had to go on the scrap heap?
I'm not sure I'm getting your question, Amelia.
Sorry, what had to go on the scrap heap in order to get rid of the additional spending?
I'm not sure what you're getting at. So we haven't changed the operating allowance. That operating allowance still exists. That operating allowance has got a one-off component in it for health. Other spending is as normal within that.
Are you doing a baseline
review?
review?
Your comments on surplus to do with the future generation, the current generation
Yep.
for its own consumption. What were those concerns that spurred you to make those changes, and also what changes could we see in the future in regards to that comment?
Yeah, so essentially what that means is that if we're continually having to borrow for the day-to-day expenditure of New Zealanders, that significantly adds to debt pressure and so on. What we should be doing in an ideal world is making sure that what we consume now we pay for in the revenue that's coming in. To get to that position post-COVID is going to take a couple of years because we had to spend so much to get New Zealanders through that. But I think it represents a good discipline to be able to make sure that we have a surplus, and that means that we are paying for what we need on a day-to-day basis. Having said that, there will always be reasons why in a given year you might need to divert from that, a specific large project or something that occurs offshore that affects us. And so there is flexibility built into the rule, so it's an average. It's not every year we have to reach that surplus. It's an average over a period of time. In terms of what changes, it really just really emphasises the importance of getting a careful balance in what we invest in, making sure that the projects we invest in are high quality. It's one of the reasons why we're doing the multi-year funding, is it gives us a much clearer picture of what we need. So no specific changes per se, but it will mean that we have to live within our means.
So just doing a baseline review as most budgets, and if so, how much money are you expecting?
As I said in my earlier comments, with the clusters, we did specific departmental reviews there. Everybody is always asked as their first port of call when they put a budget bid in, how can you pay for this within your existing revenue. There will inevitably be some savings in the budget, and I'll announce those on the day. So I'll just take Bernard and then we'll finish.
On the distinction between operating and capital spending, doesn't that restrict you from doing soft capital investments in health and education, which you could argue are building social and intellectual infrastructure?
It is a very good point, and it's one of the things that we are working through with Treasury. We are maintaining the current definitions of operating and capital spending, but one of the issues we want to work through is, for example, when we choose to do something in partnership with another entity, if the government doesn't own the asset, it's not called capital expenditure. And so therefore it hits operating. And so one of the things we've got, as I've just said, is the ability to average out. So there will be some years where we might need to do that. But we are also talking about that definition of what actually is operating capital. We're not making that change now because there's more work to do to understand what that is.
Just finally, you talk about a rainy day. If you're young and renting and you're paying too much for your rent and you're frustrated with infrastructure, isn't the rainy day right now that needs to be dealt with now?
Yep, and we are spending significantly more in capital investment than almost any other government in New Zealand's history, $57 billion over 5 years. And what I've signalled today is that we are also going to use the Crown's balance sheet to make some of those big investments. So, yep, we continue to be able to use New Zealand's economic strength to address those issues. I have to strike a balance, though. I've got to make sure I'm preparing for the worst because that actually happened, but I am confident in New Zealand's economy and I am confident we'll get on top of those issues that underpin those concerns. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.